Welcome back to my Bake Escape. In this week's video, I used another fall favorite of mine, which are apples. This is my Apple Spiced Loaf that's topped with a Chai Tea Glaze, and it is so delicious. You're going to want to make this very soon. For the full recipe, visit mybakeescape.com. Be sure to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Pinterest at mybakeescape. For this recipe, you will need a few ingredients. I chose Fuji apples for this recipe, but you can use your favorite apple. You'll also need applesauce, brown butter, brown sugar, granulated sugar, eggs, all-purpose flour, milk, and then some spices, and we'll go over those in a little bit. The spice that is a little different if you don't typically have it on hand is cardamom, so I would highly recommend that you do purchase cardamom for this recipe because it does add that level of flavor that you just can't get from using just cinnamon. I start by washing and drying all of the apples, and I prefer to peel the apples. You don't have to, you can leave the skin on, but for this recipe I did decide to peel them. So once I peeled each of the apples, I went ahead and cut them, cored them, and chopped them into bite-sized pieces. These apples were a little small, so I decided to use 4 of them, but it ended up being a little too many, so I actually only used 2 of these small apples for a total of 2 cups of chopped apples. Next, I started working on the dry ingredients. So to the flour, I added baking soda, baking powder, granulated salt, ground cinnamon, and cardamom. Once the dry ingredients have been mixed together, I move on to working on the wet ingredients. So I combine the sugars with the brown butter, making sure to get all of those dark bits in because that's where all of the flavor is. Mix this together until it's light and fluffy. This recipe calls for 4 eggs. When I use eggs in recipes, I try to break the egg into another bowl. This will eliminate shells getting into my recipe, and it'll also help avoid using an egg that maybe isn't the freshest. So I like to crack eggs in a separate bowl, make sure it looks good, no shells, and then add it to the rest of the ingredients. And I do like to mix each egg into the sugars before adding the next one. And you'll see that as I get to the 3rd egg, it has made a significant difference to the moisture in this recipe. So I would highly suggest that you use all 4 eggs. Then I added some vanilla extract, mixed that in, and the applesauce. This is unsweetened, plain applesauce. And then the milk, mix this together. Most times when making cookies or cakes or bread recipes like this, I do incorporate the flour ingredients into the wet in 3 batches. This just simply helps avoid making a big mess when I'm mixing in the flour, and it also gives the flour time to absorb into the wet mixture. Once all the flour has been incorporated, I then fold in the chopped apples. At this point, this batter smells so delicious. This recipe will make 2 9x5 loaves, or what I did this time was make 1 loaf and then I made 9 mini bundt cakes with the rest of the batter. So if you just want to make 1 loaf, then you should cut this recipe in half. To prep the loaf pan, I did spray with non-stick cooking spray and I added a piece of parchment paper. The parchment will help release the loaf from the pan later on. This is going to bake in a 350 degree oven for about 55 to 65 minutes. While the loaf baked, I went ahead and moved on to the mini bundt cakes. I purchased this pan a while ago. I don't really remember where I bought it from, but there are a variety of these available on Amazon. The most important thing when using a bundt cake pan or mold is you want to heavily grease each mold because it has a lot of grooves, and to avoid your cake from sticking to the pan after it's baked, you want to grease it sufficiently. I used an ice cream scoop to evenly distribute the batter into each of these molds. This process can be a little messy, so to just clean things up a little, I used a damp paper cloth to wipe away any excess batter that had fallen out on the edge of the pan. These also baked at 350 degrees for about 18 to 22 minutes. I checked on my loaf and it is still not done. You see that it jiggles a little bit when I press on it, so I'm going to go ahead and set it for another 5 minutes and keep checking. It looked like it was done, so I pulled it out, but when I did the toothpick test, you'll see that there is a lot of wet batter left. I did notice, however, that it was browning a little too quickly on the top, so to keep it from browning too much, I went ahead and placed a piece of aluminum foil loosely on top of the loaf and let it bake for another 8 to 10 minutes. As you can see here, it did kind of fall in the middle a little bit, but it is completely cooked all the way through, which is the most important part. When you make a loaf like this, sometimes this happens and it's not a big deal. The bread still comes out delicious, and we're going to add some icing on top, and that'll kind of help cover up that dip. So you'll never know once the icing is on it. The mini bundt cakes were also ready, and I pulled them out of the oven and I let them rest in the pan for about 5 minutes. I used a mini spatula to carefully release the cake from the sides of the pan. This will help them come out later on. And as you can see, this pan is already cool enough to the touch, so I went ahead and flipped it over, gave each mold a tap to help release the cake, and I was happy to see that every single cake came out. I allowed these to cool for about 15 to 20 minutes while I worked on the Chai Tea Glaze. For the glaze, you're going to need powdered sugar, brown sugar, heavy whipping cream, salt, butter, vanilla extract, and chai tea. I used this Tazo vanilla caramel chai. It's what I had on hand, and it actually worked just fine. So I used 2 tea bags, and the tea needed to steep in the heavy cream for about 5 minutes. So I warmed the heavy cream up in the microwave for 45 seconds to a minute, added the tea bags, and let it sit for 5 minutes. After that, I added 2 tablespoons of very hot water just to thin out the mixture a little bit, and let it steep for another 2 to 3 minutes, and this is what it looks like. So to make the glaze, you're going to need a heavy lined saucepan. Over medium-high heat, add the butter, brown sugar, and the chai tea infused milk, pressing on those tea bags to release all of that flavor. Then I added salt, mixed this together until it started to melt, and eventually it will start to boil, starting with small bubbles, and then it will go into a rapid boil. Once it starts to bubble up slightly, I give it a quick mix. And then now that it's boiling rapidly, I let this continue to boil for about a minute before adding the vanilla. When you add the vanilla, be very careful because this is very hot and it will bubble up. It doesn't last very long, but it will. It did scare me the first time I did this, so just be mindful that it will bubble up a little bit. But then it'll die down, and then you want to remove this mixture from the heat. I placed it on top of an oven mitt, and then I started incorporating the powdered sugar. I did this in 2 batches, and I used a mini spatula to mix this in. I noticed there were a lot of lumps, so I decided to put this back on the heat on low, just to kind of help melt the rest of that powdered sugar into the mixture. And then I used a small whisk to just whisk vigorously until the mixture is nice and smooth. While the glaze is still warm, I use a large spoon to glaze the top of the loaf. This mixture will dry pretty quickly and harden, so you want to move fast when you're adding this to your loaf. So I poured it on and used a spoon to gently push the glaze all over the top of the loaf and encouraging it to drip down the sides a little bit. There's something so satisfying about watching that glaze slowly drip down the sides. Now this is a double batch, and so I had to make another batch of this glaze for the buntlets. And once I made that, I went ahead and glazed each one. I love making mini buntlets. They're so cute. They're perfect to share, and these came out so good. Don't they look delicious? Oh, and they're so cute. I love these. After about 30 minutes, the icing has set, and I went ahead and sliced the loaf, and this is what it looks like on the inside. You can see there's chunks of apples, and it smells amazing, and it tastes so delicious. All of those spices really come through. That cardamom just gives it a warm, delicious flavor overall. And that icing, oh my gosh, that is the best part in my opinion. It is so delicious. I hope you give this recipe a try soon. It is very popular with my friends and family. They really liked it. If you like apples and you like spice, I highly suggest that you give this recipe a try. For the full recipe, visit mybakeescape.com. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Make sure to turn your notifications on so that you are notified when I release new content. Thank you so much for watching, and have a sweet day.